Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Short Greenhorn. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall not God avenge his own elect that cry unto him day and night, though he bear long with them? I tell thee, he shall avenge them, and he shall avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in the earth? Now he put forth a parable unto those that trusted in their own self that they were righteous and despised others. So behold, two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, the other a publican. So here we are still in the early parts of the 18th chapter of Luke. We're still finishing up the first parable, the parable of the unjust judge and the woman that came unto him saying, avenge me of my adversary. So, we would see how, this judge, he was introduced. First of all, the Lord, it was set up how the Lord, he would, speak this parable unto them to the effect that men ought to always pray and to not faint. So, understanding that, throughout this whole thing, what we are learning or what we're supposed to be learning is, a real life example in real time of how to always pray and to not faint, to always persevere, to always, be, before God, to never be found missing, from his presence, and showing, what the attitude to take and not so much a defeatist attitude. And, we saw this judge being introduced, how he feared not God, neither regarded man, how this widow kept, coming unto him, wearing him out, and he finally gave in. So, I would ask a question. He said, yet will I avenge this widow of her adversary, lest by her continual coming she weary me. So, it wasn't shown him actually carrying it out. It was just shown the turning point inside his own mind, when he realized that it would serve him better to go through with this than to not, as this woman's persistence and how she was, getting to him, how she troubled him, he described it as. All right, so here we are, and the first, verse says, and the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. So, he gave the whole introduction already. The reason why he's giving it, that they should always pray and to not faint. He introduced the judge, how he feared not God, neither regarded men. And in the same city, there was a widow. She was a widow described. She is not given as having any children, but that she had lost her husband. Her age is not given. We would assume that she's older, but remember that any age, people can lose each other. They can lose their spouses. And, we understand that this woman, she was fending for herself and, taking things into her own hands. The man of the house being gone, her having to play this masculine leadership role. You could ask the question, if he was still alive, would she still have to play this role? Was it more of a feminine nature, like, something kind of business or dealings that you would only find among women, right? Like maybe she was a seamstress and she made some clothes and the person, did not pay her. No, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that the sex of the person, male or female, is not given. Who she's complaining about, who she's going on to the judge because this person, has, somehow wronged her, I think that, if we were given the sex, we could narrow it down some more, right? Because, you would expect certain behaviors from men and certain from women, even in those times. And, we could narrow it down and we could eliminate, some of the outliers and focus in, not having been given the entire, story in its full detail. And the Lord said, acknowledging, him as creator, and acknowledging him as God, as the Lord, letting us know that this what he's about to say is trustworthy, as trustworthy as his name is, as the weight of authority his name carries. We know that earth will pass away before one jot or tittle of the law should fail. And, we know that he's always teaching them. He's always, as he said, as Paul said, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. How, he doesn't give them the whole thing in one bite. I think that he learned that the first time when he tried preaching before them, after he was baptized in the Jordan River, and it was said that he went home to Nazareth, and how he stood up in the temple reading that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, sent me to heal the brokenhearted, preach deliverance to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And then how he started rebuking them. How many widows were in Israel, but only that woman of Sarepta was helped during the famine. How many lepers were in Israel, but only Naaman the Syrian was cleansed by Elisha, and how they wanted to throw him headfirst off the cliff. So it was after that we saw him, take a different strategy. He started out with the healings first and the delivering. First thing he did was to cast out a devil in the temple before he went to Simon Peter's house, and he healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who was taken with a great fever. So, and the Lord said, so, we take a little step back here from this frame. I think that the camera view was closer on the introduction when it was said how he spake this parable unto them, that men ought to always pray and to not faint. The judge being introduced. There was a certain judge in a certain city that feared not God, neither regarded men, and the widow being introduced herself, and how he would not at first, but then, he thought within himself, right? So, and the Lord said, a turning point here. He's about to, give the lesson from the story and the nuggets. If you know that, especially like in this case, a lot of the times the introduction is to build the structure and to lead up to the turning point, to the point where, things they take off, right? They take on great meaning. There's great lessons to be learned. There's wisdom to be extracted. There's proverbs that we can construct from this thing. This thing, it can stand up and, like that, grain of a mustard seed, how it grew and waxed into a great tree. Even the fowls of the air was able to nest in its branches. How, what he's about to say, that it's gonna be like that mustard tree. How, so many things can be extracted from it. It can be used for so many, purposes, and the structure itself being so magnificent. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. So, he's, laying it out like this. And, I think that we'll get the meaning is that, if this judge that fears not God, neither regards men, and the answer that he's about to give, right? The answer he's about to give, shows that even he was mindful of God, during this thing for this widow, whatever she was coming onto him for, pointing out the fact that, parts of her was maybe trying to accomplish this on her own. Now, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing it was said of the judge that he feared not God, neither regarded man. But what about this widow? Nothing is said of her faith. It is just said that she's persistent. You could be persistent having great faith. You could be persistent having no faith, in God. Her faith is not mentioned, right? So, him, mentioning this unto her, shall not God avenge his own elect, right? Which is the next verse. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. But, him saying this unto her, if she was a non-believer, she might even be offended. This is of no use to me. You're telling me these things and I don't believe in them. So here what the unjust judge said. So he described him as unjust. Now, having explained this parable from Matthew and Mark, this is Luke. He was introduced as the unjust judge. It was in a certain city there was an unjust judge. But in this one, in Luke, it doesn't say that. It said in a certain city there was a judge that feared not God, neither regarded men. This is the first time we're seeing this word unjust. So, we can keep in mind that he is unjust judge. It's just that that term is introduced later here. So hear what the unjust judge said. And this is, to show you an extreme view of something. If you over exaggerate things, if I think that when you over exaggerate things, it's sometimes it's easier to learn them, right? Because then you realize the absurdity of things. You realize how simple they really are. You take the wheel, take the car by the wheels, and you fully master it. And what's coming to mind for me is how you would play like peekaboo with a little child, playing with a little baby. How the more exaggerated your movements and expressions are, the more it engages them. I'm here, explaining that, taking sometimes a overly exaggerated, extreme way, it can be useful, if done right. And that's what he's about to do right now. So, and the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. So, he's defining him. He's defining this parameter so you don't have to do it yourself. And he's defining this parameter so that what comes next would, highly support who he is, this judge, or highly, deny, contrast who he is. All right, so the next verse says, and shall not God avenge his own elect that cry unto him day and night, though he bear along with them? So now we have this unjust judge, and he feared not God, neither regarded man. Just like when the prophet was riding, the donkey spake to him when the angel was standing in the way with the sword drawn, ready to slay him. And he smote the donkey 3 times, and then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth. And the donkey was like, I've been your beast since I was a little young one. Have I ever been known to disobey you? And then when he opened the prophet's eyes, the Lord, when he opened the prophet's eyes, he saw the angel. So, extreme, I'm here still talking about, extreme exaggerated cases of things. In the extremity of this, of what is going on. Just as how the donkey spake, this judge, he's speaking on God, being introduced as, fearing not God, neither regarded men. Sometimes, life itself can, is almost as if it jumps inside of us and transform and takes control of us. And, this instance, it goes to show you that, you never know what's really inside of a person, right? Not because you see a person a certain way, means that there's not something inside of them that's different. Not because you see a person, behaving a certain way, living a certain way, it doesn't mean that, there's not something inside of them that, is different. And, we can see that here with this judge. Because, consciously, how he would have denied, the Lord God. Consciously, he wouldn't have anything to say about faith or, God being defender of his people, consciously. I think that, these learned men, how often is it that these learned men, they use their education to disprove God? It's almost as if, they can't explain many things. So they learn to stand on their own and not to stand on the shoulders of a creator. So no doubt this man, convening with his colleagues, other judges, other lawyers, other businessmen and dignitaries, how they sit down at their table, and they exchange ideas. And, this idea of God, being supreme, it takes a back seat. It takes a back seat to other things that they deem more important. So, I would theory and say the reason why he's like this even in the first place, fearing not God, neither regarded man, is the company that he was keeping, having been of a certain status. A judge like this, being very careful to not associate himself with too many low characters. Because, people, they seek to maintain their status, right? They seek to maintain their way of life. And, the people around them that they allow around them, is for specific reasons. So he says, and shall not God avenge his own elect, right? Putting this woman into an elect of God. Do we go then by what he is saying and assume this woman is of faith in the Lord God? Do we assume that she's a believer, a praying woman? I think that especially in those older days, you would more likely find a praying, mother or grandmother. The culture that we have today is different. We've become, so modernized. People have left God in the background. So the fact that he's speaking to her, of this, saying, shall not God avenge his own elect? He is, either, it's one of two things. Either he's, had some reason to found out that she is a believing, praying woman, a God-fearing woman. Or the second one, it could be that just because of the wrong that was done unto her, just because of the wrong that was done unto her, we assume that God, he fights, these people's battle. He said, blessed be you poor in spirit, yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are the pure in heart, they shall see God. So he's attributing, this woman being an elect unto the Lord. And, showing how God, he's the defender of his people. He's the one that fights their battles. He's the balance, at the end. He's the one that, tips the scale when things have gone out of balance to bring balance back. And it shows that this judge, he can have such a, within him, conscious knowledge of God like this and still deny him. It's amazing what we are able to do as human beings. And shall not avenge his own elect. What a powerful statement. It's not a maybe or a guess or a suppose. He's, the way he words this, it makes you understand that this is an inevitable consequence of being an elect of God. An inevitable consequence of being an elect of God. And shall not God fight your battle, of his own elect that cry unto him day and night. So now, that cry unto him day and night. So, and what he said, why is the reason that he's giving this whole thing? He spake a parable unto them to the end that men always pray unto not faint. So we see the judge even touching on that a little bit right here. Cry unto him day and night, to always pray unto not faint, though he bear along with them. And this shows that, God, he answers prayers in his time. He answers prayers according to his design, according to what he's moving, because, you can't see behind the scenes of what God is moving around, of what God is protecting you from, of what is standing in the way, ready to consume you, of the fact that you're not ready, the inexperience. There can be so many things in the way. Who's ready as a wolf to come and destroy this thing that God is, putting together for you. Even understanding that it takes more time to build a hotel than to build a house. The bigger the thing that God has waiting for you, there's probably going to be a longer wait. Because if you look at, even in creation, God created the heavens and the earth, all the animals and all these things. And then it's like he made man last. This blessing was so big, he made everything before it and then made man. So the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. So this unjust judge that fears not God, look at what he's saying. Like I said, like when the donkey opened his mouth, sometimes we hit a bottom line in life. Sometimes we hit rock bottom like that, where the situation, it becomes so ridiculous that, even, a donkey can speak. Even a non-God fearing, man like this can say something like this. It's like when, somebody has lost their heartbeat, right? How they, they shock them with that machine, the defibrillator. Sometimes life, it jolts us and, we're temporarily pushed into a space, where things like this can happen. So, we can see that this judge, he was at his wit's end, right? He was, worn out by this woman coming unto him. So though he bear along with them, when it was Jairus who came to him to bring him to her house, for his daughter was dying. How he was interrupted by the woman with the issue of blood. Sometimes God, he's passing through others to get to your house. And shall not God avenge his own elect? His own elect. Showing that, God, he doesn't slack when it comes to his people. His word, he just told them, it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law should fail. And if he said all these things about his people, I was given a revelation how, even some of the times he's waiting for the person that's doing wrong to repent. Someone that's, sometimes it's not even that that person is waiting, because it's a waiting thing, but he might be giving that person a chance to do right. So he doesn't have to, give them such a heavy judgment. All right, so the next verse says, I tell you, you shall avenge them, and you shall avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in the earth? So he's answering his own question that he put, shall not God avenge his own elect? I tell you, speedily. So, we see what the judge did here. Sometimes we will ask a question just to get a person thinking, and they will answer it before they do. Some people, they like to mess around and joke around. Some people, they're ready to waste your time. Some people, they know the right answer, but then they'll say a wrong one just to tie you up and frustrate you. So, he's actually attempting to do her thinking for her. He's, going in her driver's seat and, showing her the world around her own self that she's missing. Because, she's coming onto him for this judge to do something. I think that what the judge is trying to show here is how, the answer of God, will be greater than anything that he could do as this judge. As a matter of fact, the answer of God, would have might even brought the judge to her. She came to the judge. The answer of God could have God could have sent the judge to her, as he sent the prophet to this woman in Sarepta during the famine, as I said earlier. God sent the prophet to her. The prophet, she didn't go to the prophet. So, anytime I think of this example, I always think of, somebody like being, questioned in a court of law, like somebody's on trial, whether it was a person or not, or a witness or somebody, how, they'll ask questions, right, to lead you to common sense. All of these questions, they're designed to lead you to common sense and show you the obvious answer. Now wherever you were, what conditions, was going on, you might not have been thinking, logically. We go through our day, we go in and out of consciousness. You might catch us at a bad time, we might be tired, we might just, you caught us on a bad day. There's really no reason, other that we can, explain why this thing happened that it did. So I tell thee, yes, he shall avenge them, and he shall avenge them speedily. So, like I said, he's putting himself in her shoes and showing him, unto her, being in her shoes, walking around, thinking how she should be thinking. Like, you don't realize all these things you have available. I used to have a motorcycle, and, one of my good friends who was a good rider, he asked to ride it. And when I gave it to him, the things that he did, it's so amazing, right? Him being an expert at this thing. I didn't know my motorcycle could do all those things. So the judge, he's doing the same thing here. You didn't know you could do this. You didn't know you could also do this and that. You didn't know that this was available to you. Like I said, keep in mind that it was said of him that, he feared not God, neither regarded man. And Jesus himself said, hear what the unjust judge said. So now, this term unjust, which means, he's crooked, right? That's what unjust is. Somebody that's crooked, they, when they're supposed to make the right decision, something stops them, bribery, just being spiteful, just having a wicked, evil heart. Many things can, interrupt them from making the right decision that they're supposed to make. So he answers the question, I tell thee, yes, he shall avenge them. He's giving her a lesson here. We know that God, he's the friend to the poor, right? And like I said, this woman's faith is not given. How did this, judge figure out that she, was a woman of faith? Or is he just going by the fact that she was wrong and God, he, fights for the wrong? So nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in the earth? So, why do we have, him avenging them speedily versus, when he comes, shall he find faith in the earth? It just, remember, it's Jesus that's telling this story. It goes to show you that, faith, one form of faith is believing that God, he, fights your battles. One form of faith is knowing that God, he defends you. Because, she was coming onto this judge, nonstop, over and over and over, be persistent to achieve, the result that she was trying to. So, we understand and we get from this here that faith, being such a dynamic thing, there's many, aspects to faith. Faith is believing that, like he said, seek ye first the kingdom of God. Why did he say that? Because they were seeking after what they shall eat and what they shall put on, right? How, these things shall be added unto you, food and clothing. That's one form of faith. Another form of faith is, the ability to provide for your family. Another form of faith is protection. And if you are wronged or something is done, how God, he will make it right. Faith, understand that you can't, say certain things, you can't go certain places, you can't do certain things, right? Because of your faith. So nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in the earth? When he returneth, and why is he saying this? Because, understanding, he just got done dealing with them about all these things. How, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall they be in the days of the Son of Man. How they married, were given in marriage, they ate and they drank until Noah entered into the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all because of how they were living, in the days of Lot, in Sodom. They ate and drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, building until the day Lot came out of Sodom, and they rained fire and brimstone. Let not him that is in the field return to the house. Let not him that is on the housetop come down to take anything from the house. Two shall be in one bed, one taking one left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, one taking one left. Two men shall be in the field. In the last days there shall come perilous times. Men shall be lovers of themselves more than lovers of the things of God, having a form of godliness and even denying the power thereof. This judge is doing. So, it's understanding these things why he's asking this question. When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in the earth? Will this virus that's spreading, in mankind's mind, corrupt everyone to the point where, even decent, simple, morality would be, completely gone, and where we would just be driven by our basic, instincts. I say, yes, he shall avenge them, and he shall avenge them speedily. Now, this avenging them speedily. All right, so here's a question. How could he say, though he bear along with them? Shall not God avenge his own elect that cry, day and night unto him, though he bear along with them? I tell you, yes, he shall avenge them, and he shall avenge them speedily. How could he bear, how could God answer, bear along with them, but yet still he shall avenge them speedily? These are two opposite things, right? It goes to show you that, well, bearing long is actually receiving the manifestation of the thing. But, avenging them speedily is, as soon as it's done, God, he knows his heart. I think that's the answer to, when you put those two things together. As soon as it's done, how, when it was said that Daniel prayed 21 days for an answer. And, the angel, when he finally got there, he said, since the first day you prayed, I was coming with the answer, but the prince of Persia, the devil, withstood me for 21 days. So though he bear along with them, right, that's waiting for a long time. I tell you, yes, he shall avenge them speedily, which means that what? The decision is instant for God. It's just that the manifestation and the receiving the thing. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted unto him, for righteousness. But he didn't get that child until he was 100 years old. So God avenged him speedily, but he did bear along with Abraham. So when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in earth? When he's returning, is he gonna only the dead in Christ rising? Because those which are alive and remain will have no faith. They will be like Sodom. They will be like in the days of Noah. Completely everybody question. And it goes to show you what we're dealing with and what we should be looking out for and what we should expect is that, the heart of man in these last days is going to lead to this question being asked. When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find any faith in the earth? Will any be left? All right, so the next verse says, and he put forth a parable unto them that trusted in their own selves that they were righteous and despised others. So now here we have, I think that happens too often. When you see this and you understand that it's possible, you would expect that this would be a minority thing. But the fact that God, Jesus, he's teaching on this right now, it was happening too much. Not only was it happening too much, it was too loud. These people, they walk around, they make themselves so prominent, so known, it's hard to miss them. And being so loud, how many people are going to follow suit and fall into something like this? So if you understand, who is he speaking onto? It's the religious leaders. I know that you maybe have, one or two that were not even religious leaders, but they still ended up, in something like this. I think that wealth is likely to cause a person to go down this road. Having a lot of money, influence, and status. I can say that because what was it said that all the people that heard him, even the publicans, justified God being baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against their own selves, being not baptized by John. So it was the leaders, and the trap that they fell into is because they were the officially ordained ones of the temple. They were the ones that on paper had the authority over the temple. And if you understand, authority, once you have it over somebody, you look at them differently, right? In civil or domestic, situation, when the police show up, they're in charge, right? You answer their questions. If you're a suspect, they take you in. They have complete control over that thing. Imagine a bystander, right, taking over the police, right, and having them answer his question and them be subject unto him. How ridiculous would that look, right? It's the same reason why, it's understood that they had, the official rule of the temple. And Jesus, as much as his miracles were great and his doctrine was so different, they still had authority over him on paper in the temple. They couldn't bring anybody back from the dead. They couldn't cast out devils. They couldn't heal the leprosy, the palsy, woman with the issue of blood. They couldn't do any of those things. But yet still, they still had authority on paper over him. And that's the trap that they fall into. Just as how, the police, when they show up to that situation, nobody, no civilian, right, take over and then have them sit down and answer their question. And, as much as Jesus was the Messiah, they let their authority, override common sense, and understand that we're not standing on judgment day, right? we're not standing him as judge. And so in this moment, they can't just deny everything that he's doing and still walk away justified because it's not time yet. But if it was time, then they would have to obviously humble themselves, seeing all these things. And that's why he says, we walk by faith and not by sight. So people that trust in themselves that they were righteous and even despising others. I see a thing happen where, I think that people, they're calculating, people are solving equations in this thing. They're giving themselves points for certain things that they do. I fast, right? I give to the poor, right? I, do this, I do that. And then at the end of the day, they give themselves a total number of points. And then, they walk around with this in their minds. And now they think that they're better than everyone. They're even able to look down on others. So they trusted in their own selves that they were righteous and despised others. And you notice it's saying here that they trusted in their own selves and not in God. What's the difference with trusting in God and not in your own self? I think that when you trust in God, you leave a continual open stance. An open stance versus a closed stance. When you trust in yourself, you get a closed stance, and you're closed off, and that's why you can find yourself, despising others. But trusting in God, it understands that you're waiting on Him. You're waiting on Him for that answer. You're waiting on Him to move. You're waiting on Him to make all things beautiful. You're waiting on him and you have to sit there and wait. He's always saying here, he that is greatest among you shall be least and servant of all. When you think of a servant, right, they sit there and they wait. He just told a parable, which of you shall have a servant plowing or feeding cattle and shall say by and by unto him when he's come from the field, go and sit down to meat. No, you're going to tell him, make ready where I might eat, and gird thyself and serve me until I have eaten and drinking, and then afterwards you shall eat and drink. So this servant, he has to sit there and watch his master eat. And for you to trust in God, you're like that servant. You're there, you're waiting. What does the master need? Does he need more bread? Does he need me to get him a new spoon? Does he need me to bring some more water? Trusting in God is having that open stance, waiting, understanding that he gives the commands and not you. So they trust in themselves and despise others. One bad thing leading to a worse thing. If you're supposed to be, servant to all, there's no way you could go down this route. Something went amiss, somewhere. All right, so the last verse says, two men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other a publican. So he's setting up the story, just like how he just introduced the judge and the woman. So now we're in the temple. So, expect something of, faith, something of prayer, teaching, preaching, something having to do with the temple and, religion, obviously. Two men went up there to pray. So now they're given a Pharisee and a publican. So now, understanding that the Pharisees, they are a sect, religious sect. It's more like a way of life than an official thing, right? The scribes were, the lawyers, right? They find details of the law was their business, and they were officially employed. The Sadducees, they were, elite, families of priests, very rich. They taught only from the five books of Moses. They were based in the temple in Jerusalem. They didn't believe in the afterlife, whereas the Pharisees, they, went by the whole Old Testament as well as the oral teachings of the elders. The Sadducees did not go by the oral teachings. The Pharisees also believe in, the resurrection of the dead. Sadducees did not. And scribe could be either a Pharisee or a Sadducee. It was an occupation, rather than a set of beliefs. So that's the difference between a Pharisee, scribe, and a Sadducee. Is that the Pharisees and Sadducees were bodies of believers, but there was a job or occupation to be a scribe, which means the scribes were mostly Pharisees, it was said, but there were some Sadducees that were scribes also. Not having authority like the chief priests and elders, right? Even the high priest. And the publican here, as it said, was a tax collector, a Jew that was a tax collector for the Romans. Remember, they were under Roman rule, right? And the Romans were taxing them, just as you could find, in the days of kings, whenever they conquered somewhere or they had control, people had to pay taxes onto them. So now, instead of having Romans, collect these taxes, certain Jews were allowed to collect tax. They had to pay a huge sum for this job. And, upon reading, I have a question about their wages. I was not able to answer, right? Did they, their wages, were they paid wages, or was it just the extra of the taxes? Because they were allowed to collect extra, and they would get the extra amount that was not required to pay for the taxes. There was a rate that was expected, and then they could charge over that, and they would keep the difference. The publicans, they were considered enemies of their own people, the Jews. Why are you collecting taxes for these our enemies? So, understanding that we have this Pharisee and this publican. This Pharisee, this religious person, believing in the five books of Moses and the whole Old Testament, believing in the resurrection from the dead. They were mostly students also. They separated from the Romans unlike the Sadducees. It was said that the Sadducees, they associated with the Romans to maintain their status. And the publican here is tax collector for the Romans. All right, so here we are in the early part still of the 18th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, "And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought to always pray and to not faint. For there was in a certain city a judge that feared not God neither regarded men. And in that same city there was a widow, and she came unto him, saying, Avenge me of my adversary. And though he would not at first, he said within himself, Yea, though I fear not God neither regard men, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her of her adversary, lest by her continual coming she weary me." So then we pick up right here where it says, "And then the Lord said, Hear what the unjust judge said. Shall not God avenge his own elect that cry unto him day and night, though he bear long with them? I tell you, he shall avenge them, and he shall avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith in the earth? And then he spake a parable unto them, which trusted in their own selves that they were righteous, and despised others. Behold, two men went up in the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, and the other a publican." I am Straw Greenhorn.